This story has 3 updates. Initial story. I have been married to my wife for many years, and until recently, I believed our daily routine was predictable and straightforward. We lived in a simple home on the outskirts of town, close enough to shopping areas and local businesses, but far enough to avoid constant noise. I worked for a local distribution company, handling shipments and inventory records, while my wife held a position in a small administrative office for a regional supply firm. Our days often began early, with quick breakfasts and separate drives to our respective workplaces. Evenings tended to be quiet, usually involving a simple dinner, and sometimes watching a few programs before turning in. For the longest time, I noticed no signs that anything was amiss. My wife sometimes stayed late at work to finish tasks, and I assumed she had responsibilities requiring overtime. There were occasional weekends when she said she had to meet a friend or help someone with errands, and I never questioned these outings. Over time, small inconsistencies began to appear. I found receipts for cafes and restaurants I had never visited with her, tucked away in odd places like inside old magazines or behind pantry items. When I asked about these receipts, she offered vague explanations, saying they were from lunch breaks with colleagues or casual meetings with old acquaintances. I tried not to dwell too much on it, figuring that everyone deserves some personal space. Months passed, and I noticed that my wife's cell phone habits changed. She started always keeping it close, never leaving it on the coffee table as she used to. Whenever a message arrived, she would step into another room or tilt the screen away from my view. I recall one evening after a long day at work, she claimed she had to make a quick run to a nearby store, but left dressed more carefully than usual, returning much later than expected. A few weeks after that incident, I discovered a crumpled piece of paper in the glove compartment of her car while searching for a misplaced receipt. It had initials and short notes that made no sense to me, along with a few times and dates scribbled hurriedly. I asked her casually if she had lent the car to anyone, and she shook her head, looking annoyed that I even asked. At that point, I started paying closer attention to her excuses and the timeline she provided. Whenever I pressed for small details about where she had been, her answers seemed inconsistent. If I asked her about someone named M or J from a note I saw in passing, she would say they were just people from work, then immediately change the topic. I decided to check our phone records, something I never bothered with before. I accessed the account online and saw multiple calls and text messages to 7 different numbers I did not recognize. These were not occasional calls. They were frequent and often occurred at times I knew I was tied up at work or busy with chores. I made a list of these unfamiliar numbers and tried to connect them to anyone we knew. No matches appeared in my memory or among our acquaintances. I began noting down when my wife left the house and comparing those times to the call records. Patterns emerged. She often contacted these numbers before stepping out, and sometimes right after returning. She used excuses like grocery runs that took far too long, last-minute errands for work, or helping a friend I never met. One afternoon, when she said she had a meeting across town that would run late, I followed her in one of our company vehicles. I stayed several cars behind, making sure she wouldn't spot me. She parked near a small apartment complex I had never seen before, in a part of the city we rarely visited. I watched from a distance as she entered the building. After more than an hour, she emerged with a man I did not know, and they hugged and kissed before she walked to her car to leave. I did not confront her that night. Instead, I repeated the same strategy on another occasion, waiting until she announced another odd errand. This time, she ended up at a different location, a modest house on a quiet street. She knocked on the door. was welcomed inside by another unfamiliar man and stayed there for about an hour before leaving. Over the course of several weeks, I documented 7 distinct individuals she met in secret. Each person lived in a different area, and none of these encounters resembled simple friendships. Her visits were always timed for when she expected me to be occupied. I took photos from a distance, noting license plates, addresses, and the time she arrived and left. I checked our financial records and saw withdrawals and charges that made no sense in the context of our normal spending. Small hotel bookings in nearby towns, unexplained purchases from gift shops, occasional large cash withdrawals that vanished without explanation. All of it formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. My wife was cheating with 7 different men. I gathered the evidence, printed call logs, snapshots taken discreetly with my phone's camera, notes of dates and times, copies of suspicious receipts. On a Saturday afternoon, I waited until she returned home from one of her so-called errands. When she walked in, I handed her the folder and told her to look at what's inside. When she saw the array of documents, photographs, and highlighted phone records, she tried to maintain a neutral expression. I asked her directly to explain what I had found. She denied everything at first, claiming I misunderstood, calling me paranoid and controlling. I pointed to the photos of her walking hand in hand with the man outside that small apartment complex. She threw the folder on the floor and yelled that I had no right to spy on her. I stepped back, letting her shout and pace. No apology emerged, only anger and an attempt to blame me for digging into her private affairs. She slammed doors, knocked over a chair, and stormed out of the room. In the days that followed, the tension in the house became a constant presence. Any attempt I made to discuss the matter calmly ended in more shouting or denial. She claimed I had caused this mess by snooping, never acknowledging the wrongdoing. I contacted a lawyer to understand my options. The lawyer advised me to gather all important financial documents, secure my personal belongings, and be prepared to file for divorce. I followed that advice, renting a small storage unit to keep documents and valuables out of her reach. My wife's behavior grew more erratic, leaving the house without explanation and returning hours later, sometimes with the smell of alcohol lingering in the air. I decided to file for divorce, as there was no trust left and no willingness from her to address what had happened. She received the papers and responded with insults, calling me weak and accusing me of ruining her life. I ignored these outbursts, focusing instead on moving forward with the legal process. I informed my lawyer of the hostile environment at home and arranged to stay at a motel for a few nights until I could secure a better living arrangement. During this period, I communicated with her only through brief texts regarding logistical matters, like when I would pick up some clothes or personal items. Her responses were always confrontational. Eventually, my lawyer arranged the first steps towards sorting out our assets and liabilities. With the evidence of her actions, I understood that a quick and fair division might be challenging, but I was determined to see it through. I settled into a temporary apartment across town that allowed a 6-month lease and waited for the legal wheels to turn. My wife made no effort to reconcile or explain herself beyond anger and denial. As weeks passed, I realized I had more peace living apart, even in a small, rented space, than I ever could under the same roof with her now. I knew that once the divorce finalized, I would not look back. Update 1. After serving the divorce papers, I arranged a meeting with my lawyer to discuss the next steps. We reviewed the assets, the house, a small savings account, a couple of long-term certificates, and a modest collection of personal possessions. My lawyer also advised me to amend any insurance policies that I had my soon-to-be ex-wife on. I learned that our state followed equitable distribution, so we aimed for a fair division of property. My wife sent a message through her lawyer demanding that we try mediation first. I agreed, hoping to avoid a lengthy court battle. The first mediation session took place in a neutral office downtown. My wife arrived late, dressed as if she wanted to show everyone how inconvenienced she felt. When we sat down at the table with the mediator, she tried to cast me as some invasive figure who had spied on her for no reason. The mediator kept the discussion focused on property and finances, ignoring personal accusations. We listed assets, the house, some savings, 2 cars, and various furnishings. My wife attempted to inflate the value of certain items, claiming sentimental worth that had never been mentioned before. The mediator requested documentation, and I provided receipts and appraisals. After a few hours, we had a rough outline of how we might split the assets. No final agreement was reached, but progress was made. My wife glared at me as we left, offering no words, just a bitter look. A week later, my lawyer sent revised proposals based on the mediator's notes. I agreed with most of them, but insisted on fairness when it came to our joint savings, refusing to give in to her inflated claims. Communication remained strained, with all messages filtered through our attorneys. My lawyer scheduled a second mediation session to finalize more details. In the meantime, I moved more personal items from the house into my new apartment. I avoided direct contact with my wife, arriving only when I knew she would be absent. Friends helped me carry boxes and belongings, and I stored everything neatly in my new space. I prepared for the second mediation session, gathering more documents, bank statements, and a clear timeline of when accounts were created. I wanted no room for her to argue about missing records or unverified claims. Update 2. The second mediation session took place about 3 weeks later. This time, both lawyers came armed with organized folders, ensuring no confusion over values or ownership. The mediator began by confirming what had been agreed upon last time and addressing unresolved items. We discussed the house first. My wife wanted to keep it, claiming she deserved the place, but the mediator looked at the mortgage records and our contributions. I had paid the majority of the mortgage, while she had covered smaller household expenses. The mediator suggested a buyout option. If she wanted the house, she would compensate me for my share of the equity. My wife protested, saying I didn't need that much money and could manage with less. The mediator reminded her that personal feelings were irrelevant. The numbers spoke for themselves. Next, we moved on to the cars. We owned 2 vehicles, a sedan we bought together and an older car I used for commuting. My wife demanded the newer sedan, insisting it was hers, even though both our names were on the title. The mediator proposed that she keep the sedan and I keep the older car, with a small adjustment in the final settlement to reflect the difference in value. I agreed, valuing a quick end to this process more than the car itself. Then came the savings account and certificates. I had documentation showing that both of us contributed to these accounts, but I placed more funds into them over time. My wife tried to claim that she deserved a larger share, citing vague reasons that the mediator dismissed. In the end, a near 50-50 split was proposed, slightly favoring me for my greater contributions. The mediator asked if either of us objected. I did not object, accepting it as a reasonable compromise. My wife hesitated, glancing at her lawyer, who whispered something to her. She finally nodded, still looking displeased. We then reviewed personal belongings, furniture, and small valuables. I requested a few items that held practical value to me: a desk, some tools, and certain kitchen appliances. She tried to argue over trivial things like throw pillows and old lamps, but the mediator stayed firm, advising against wasting time on minor items. Finally, we outlined a near-complete settlement agreement. The mediator asked both of us to review everything and return for a final session to sign the official documents. By this point, it seemed the major hurdles were cleared. I left feeling closer to resolving this chapter and moving forward. Update 3. A few weeks later, we met for the final mediation session. All terms were typed up, itemized, and ready for signatures. The mediator went through each clause, ensuring both sides understood the conditions. My wife tried a last-minute complaint about the house valuation, but the mediator reminded her that she had previously agreed. Both lawyers acknowledged that no substantial objections remained. We signed the papers confirming the property division, the division of savings, and who kept which vehicle. The mediator shook our hands, informing us that these agreements would be submitted to the court. A court date was set for a brief hearing where a judge would finalize the divorce. On the scheduled day, I took time off work and arrived at the courthouse early. My wife arrived just on time, saying little. The judge reviewed the documents, asked a few procedural questions, and accepted the terms. Within minutes, the marriage was legally dissolved. After leaving the courthouse, I returned to my apartment and placed the finalized papers in a locked drawer. I made no attempt to contact my ex-wife, and she made no attempt to reach out to me. With the legal process complete, I focused on reorganizing my life in my new place, free from the turmoil that had dominated recent months. Men, I want to tell you, please think long and hard before getting married. I realized I was a simp. I guess that's what you guys call it. Marriage isn't beneficial for men. Remember this. It might keep money in your pocket in the future.